with Watch Dogs Legion, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and now, Far Cry 6, it seems as if this generation of Ubisoft game is coming to a close. Watch Dogs has seen a slow but steady progression since the original launched at the very start of the previous console generation. Assassin's Creed reinvented itself completely after the wild success of The Witcher 3, and Far Cry 3 would launch almost 10 years ago and still serve as a foundation for all of its future titles. If I were a betting man, I'd guess that Far Cry 6 will likely serve as a very last game in Ubisoft's current design philosophy, as the next generation of hardware opens up new possibilities to go back to the drawing board. Far Cry 6 doesn't reinvent the franchise, and it likely won't be making any lists for Game of the Year, but for players who love the Far Cry formula, being able to enjoy a gameplay experience refined over the last decade might just be the comfort food they need. To get things out the way early, I was lucky enough to be invited to an early capture session, which was actually my first in my 5 years of being on YouTube, because as it turns out, it's actually easier to talk to real militia fighters and child soldiers than it is to play them early in a video game. In my 4.5-hour session, the game was actually streaming from a PC setup within a Ubisoft office, so not only is this footage capped at 1080p, but the input lag might make things look more clunky than it actually is. The only things I'm not allowed to talk about were a few of the super early story details, so apart from that, I'll just plan to call things how I see them. The game is set in the fictional Caribbean nation of Yara, but the setting was obviously heavily inspired by Cuba, and it's likely the writers went in this direction to both avoid some understandable controversy and have the freedom to create their own story. The premise is that the country is ruled by an almost cartoonishly brutal dictator, played by the talented Giancarlo Esposito, while the player takes the role of former conscripted soldier turned freedom fighter, Danny Rojas. This is about the extent of the story I'll be covering, as I spent most of my time doing extracurricular activities, but judging from previous entries in the series, viewers can probably expect a perfectly fine story that you probably won't remember by the time you come back for a second playthrough. What you will absolutely remember is how characters look like they're the ruler of a 1,000-year empire from the Civilization series before they send you out on missions, a novelty that never got old, no matter how many times it happened. The gameplay of Far Cry 6 remains mostly unchanged from previous entries, meaning sneaking into bases, upgrading your arsenal, and getting lost in the enormous world return as extremely solid foundations. With this in mind, unlike a lot of previous titles, there's an extreme focus on progression this time around, and as you'll be told 100 times by the NPCs, a large focus on choosing the right tools for the right job. We saw a heavier system of progression in Far Cry New Dawn, where higher level enemies would literally soak up hundreds of bullets until you could match their level, and Far Cry 6 seems to be a compromise between this design philosophy and that of traditional Far Cry games. For example, most enemies can be taken down in only a few hits, but without upgrading some of your weapons to specifically have armor-piercing rounds. Players are likely to dump entire magazines into dummy thick boys without taking them down. In terms of the guns themselves, I don't expect anyone to be disappointed with the variety on offer, and because I'm a thorough degenerate when it comes to these things, I even took the liberty of counting them all. All up, there were 13 rifles, 10 special weapons, 7 submachine guns, 5 LMGs, 4 sniper rifles, 6 shotguns, 2 bows, 4 launchers, 6 regular sidearms, and 3 auto pistols. In terms of weapon customization, there were 2 cosmetic slots for the paint job and charm, but also 3 attachment slots for ammo type, muzzle, and sight. Ammo types ranged from armor piercing, poison, and explosive to name a few. Sights are pretty self-explanatory, while the muzzle affected both weapon handling and the quality of silencers. This is important, because unlike previous titles, the scrappy nature of the guns in Far Cry 6 means depending on your suppressor, you might only be able to shoot a few bullets at a time before the muzzle overheats and the gun goes loud. Another layer of progression baked into the game. The special weapons will likely make the top spots as crowd favorites, with everything from a modified nail gun, a flamethrower, and an EMP gun. all making up this much more interesting category. My personal favorite was a super powerful revolver that came with a heavy shield, which was able to one-shot pretty much anyone unlucky enough to find themselves in my way. A nice bonus is that all of them have unique upgrades specific to each weapon, meaning there's a limited amount of customization beyond just better handling or a nicer scope. Like pretty much every game with guns these days, Far Cry 6 also gives players a super ability in the form of Supremos, which are super powerful abilities that will usually wipe out entire squads at a time. These ranged from everything from homing rockets, the ability to make a gas cloud, and one which is able to rapidly heal the player to the point of invincibility. The Ubisoft representative who was taking me through the process told me that they had never seen anyone use a healing option before, and as someone who's played Overwatch since its 2016 release, neither had I. One interesting choice this time around is the complete removal of the skill tree, which is a pretty bold move, considering how much this game seems to have such a heavy focus on progression. In its place is a focus on gear, which all come with their own perks and their own soft rarity rating. I was personally pretty skeptical of this change initially, but I think the reason behind this system is to give players more powerful perks while being able to cap their power by only providing 5 slots. For example, I wanted to become faster on foot, so I opted with the parkour gear, which did things like improve stamina and grant a significant and long-lasting boost of speed after sliding. This meant that in many cases, I would sometimes be fast enough to run to neighboring villages, as it was more or less faster than finding a vehicle and following a road. For those wondering, I was also assured there was no special bonus for equipping entire sets, meaning players will be able to mix and match depending on their needs. It was difficult to know exactly how much gear was on offer, as the maximum rank in the build I played was 4, while the maximum rank in game was a whopping 14. Players rank up by capturing outposts and generally being a nuisance to the nation's military, and I suspect this is where a lot of the soft level gating will take place. I can't say how strong the high-end gear becomes near the end game, but for this kind of system, I suspect players will likely be able to gain some bonkers perks before the end credits roll. I actually asked my Ubisoft babysitter whether there was any reason to not just map out the best gear on a wiki and beeline it to those locations at the start of the game. However, they seemed to know about as much as myself when it came to the demo, and I suspect the top tier gear will be hidden behind some seriously difficult content. Something that was mentioned was a form of endgame after players complete the campaign, and although I wasn't able to get any specific details, it sounded as if there were exceptionally hard missions on offer, which granted some of the game's most lucrative rewards. Viewers are free to make fun of me later if this turns out to be complete bullshit. If you thought we were done with progression, then hold the fuck up, because these fuckers will literally put progression in your progression. The map itself is absolutely fucking enormous, which for viewers who might have watched this channel for a while, makes me somewhat nervous. I absolutely prefer a quality over quantity approach when it comes to content, and if the last few Assassin's Creed games have taught us anything, Ubisoft sometimes makes a habit of making fucking enormous maps and not necessarily filling them with new and interesting things to do. This might just be me overanalyzing the huge scale of the map, but I'd advise viewers to be cautiously optimistic. What I will say is that there seemed to be a form of level gating for different regions of the map, and at one point, when I attempted to make my way to the northernmost city on foot, the game actually teleported me back down south. I likely suspect that this was unique to the preview build, as they didn't want degenerate YouTube idiots like myself showing off the first urban environment in a Far Cry game, and I predict that in the final build, players will be able to go anywhere they want, knowing they'll probably get absolutely murked in those higher tier zones. What will likely not surprise anyone at this point is that there's even a base building mechanic, which is pretty much just an upgrade screen to give players access to other buildings, which are then used to upgrade yourself even more. What I will say is that viewers should probably temper their expectations when it comes to the vehicles on offer, as the build I played only had 4 customizable rides and around the same amount of helicopters. I probably shouldn't even have to mention this at all by now, but players will be expected to clear out anti-aircraft guns in each area to even have the privilege of flying in those skies, so don't expect to be getting around the map quite as quickly as Far Cry 5. Fortunately, players will have access to horses, which can be called from stations all around the map, and can be customized similarly to the cars on offer. As I had the deepest respect for these animals, I only found it appropriate to treat them as I would any other human within the game, as I honored them with my official Yeren greeting. The follower system returns from previous games, however it seems as if humans have taken a backseat to a full cast of animals on offer. These include Guapo the crocodile, Chicharron the rooster, and Carrizo, the heart-melting wiener dog on wheels. In the build I played, Carrizo didn't like chasing the balls I threw, presumably because they were too big for his happy little schnoz. However, rest assured, this feedback was passed on to the development team. Keeping with the word of the day, your companions also become stronger the more you use their abilities, with Carrizo becoming better at finding loot, and Guapo being able to self-revive after being taken down. Alternatively, it's also worth mentioning that the entire game after the initial tutorial mission will be playable in co-op, and from everything I've seen, this very much looks like the ideal way to play the game. I'm very much looking forward to giving my friend's horse the official Yara greeting when the game eventually drops. Aside from around a million ways to become stronger, the actual process of what you'll be doing to reach these milestones looks about as enjoyable as ever. In this sense, it really just is more Far Cry, which might disappoint some players, but for people like myself who like this gameplay loop, I'm not about to complain. The only real downgrade from Far Cry 5 is there was no access to shovels, which I unironically found to be the most fun weapon from that game. 0 out of 10, not enough shovels. Although it does just feel like more Far Cry, the variety certainly feels wider than previous titles, with one mission sending you into a treasure cave, another tasking you with finding the secret entrance to a resistance hideout, and one particular standout, tasking you with rescuing hostages from a cargo ship. The stream lag really hampered my ability to know exactly how good the gunplay feels, but even if it's only as good as Far Cry 5, you wouldn't hear any complaints on my end. Admittedly, I have a strange relationship to Ubisoft as a whole. I often think to myself, what exactly it means to be a Ubisoft game, and that's a question I consistently find difficult to answer. With over 19,000 employees with studios from all over the world, the company's strengths seem to lie in its ability to both develop games quickly and to use what was learned from past projects to fast-track systems into new games. Liberating towers, aerial reconnaissance, and RPG elements have all come in waves over the publisher's main franchises, which is great for speedy development, but not for reaching gold medals in the gaming world. Viewers might remember that we recently statistically ranked the top game subscription services, and although Ubisoft Plus actually dominated in a few key categories, the major metric that brought them down was their ability to produce those super high quality games, rated 9 out of 10 and above. From what I can tell, the whole Ubisoft business model rests on its ability to produce consistent 8s, meaning games that are fun and enjoyable, but not something you'd ever consider game of the year. I can only assume that the work it would take to gain another 2 points just isn't worth the risk over taking another solid release, but I really just wish the company would take the time to shoot for those gold medals. This isn't to say that Ubisoft has an inability to come up with creative concepts in their own way. For Honor completely reinvented the fighting game mold, which had existed for decades before its release. Black Flag is almost unchallenged for the title of the best pirate game ever made. Far Cry Blood Dragon was an office joke, which turned into one of their highest rated games to date, and Rainbow Six Siege has proven itself to be the most ambitious and refined tactical shooter ever made. However, in my humble opinion, Ubisoft's most incredible and innovative achievement is likely its most forgotten. Over 4 Assassin's Creed releases, the games actually came with competitive multiplayer, and even to this day, it's difficult to find anything even close to its unique and skillful gameplay. The general premise is that you'd be dropped in a world as your specific character, and every single NPC in the server would be a copy of everyone's player models. You'd then be tasked with assassinating another player, and only given a compass to their general direction, meaning you'd have to either take your chances if they were blending in with a crowd, or wait until they acted suspiciously in the pursuit of their own target. The higher you sat on the scoreboard, the more players would have you as their bounty target, meaning you'd either have to be fast enough to avoid them catching up, or have enough game sense to pick out suspicious members of the crowd and stun them before they picked you out. However, perhaps the greatest part of this entire system were that points were awarded depending on the subtlety of the kill and the method of assassination. Running up like a madman and murking someone might only award a player with 100 points, but patiently waiting in a crowd and quietly puncturing a lung might net the player up to 10 times that amount. The abilities made this even more interesting, as firecrackers could blind and disorient targets and pursuers. Morph would turn the immediate crowd into copies of yourself, and disguise would change your appearance completely. Mix this in with a bunch of varied game modes and a decent progression system, and I'm still happy to sing its praises all these years later. Even now, this niche has no competition, and I just hope that Ubisoft can realize the gems it already has, knowing that it doesn't have to try to capture the market of other games when it can have a monopoly of its own. Perhaps the reason I bring this up at all is to demonstrate that Ubisoft is more than capable of coming up with fresh and tantalizing concepts, but for whatever reason, tends to be risk adverse. Assassin's Creed's transition to an RPG was almost certainly a response to the wild success of The Witcher 3, but in doing so, it abandoned nearly everything that made the series so popular in the first place. The series that was always based on the 3 pillars of parkour, social stealth, and combat became unrecognizable. Parkour was a shadow of its former self, social stealth was removed completely, and the combat was more reliant on your level, as opposed to your skill with the game mechanics. I mean, for fuck's sake, you didn't even play as an assassin in a game called Assassin's Creed. Ubisoft isn't afraid to make changes, but not without those changes already being market tested and approved for consumption. Watch Dogs fell into a different trap entirely, with Legion replacing the strong lead of Marques Brownlee from the second game, and attempting an admittedly ambitious system of allowing people to play as literally anyone on the street. The problem was that this stripped away so much of the customization and progression from the previous titles, and left us with characters you could never truly come to love. I've mentioned this before, but Ubisoft's narrative strength has always been in its creation of likable characters, as opposed to the story itself, and when that's taken away, their games tend to suffer. You're likely to remember Vaas from Far Cry 3, Ezio from the Desmond era, and Edward Kenway from Edward Kenway's Merry Adventure, but there's no fucking way you can recall the stories from any of those games. Unfortunately, it seems as if playing it safe might be solidified into the business model, with the upcoming free-to-play shooter, X-Defiant, looking to be about as unique as the typical Twitch streamer. Perhaps an unpopular opinion, but I'm genuinely excited for this title, more than I care to admit, as although it doesn't seem to have a single original bone in its body, it just looks like every single shooter I've ever enjoyed over the past 5 years, and just maybe, that's all it needs to be. As I said at the start of this video, I think Far Cry 6 marks a turning point for the franchise, and the company as a whole. It's the start of a new generation, and this game serves as the peak of what this formula can offer. If I can place a few bets right now, I think a few things are likely to happen. Firstly, I think Watch Dogs will revert to a main character format, and whatever systems they put in place will likely serve as the trendsetter for their other franchises. Next up, with Assassin's Creed moving to a live service, it makes it harder to know what exactly the future of the franchise will bring. With this kind of freedom, I'm expecting the next entry to span over a lot more regions, and very likely multiple time periods in the same area. In terms of the combat, knowing Ubisoft's affinity for remaking the best features of the day, I wouldn't be surprised if they used Ghost of Tsushima as a guide and have players build towards certain playstyles. Alternatively, what's also likely is that the entire game will be based around a hero system, with new assassins being added to the live service as a way to monetize the game. It wouldn't be at all surprising if the next Assassin's Creed was free to play. As for Far Cry itself, it wouldn't be surprising to see it lean more into a survival game. The huge number of progression systems are already here, and from what I can tell, the franchise is only a few base building systems away from getting to that point anyway. Throw in a few customizable squad mates, and a commitment to new hardware, and there's no reason the game couldn't tell the story of the birth of a rebellion, to its eventual overthrow of a country. For now, I'm very satisfied with where Ubisoft has landed with the Far Cry franchise, and I expect it'll be just as fun as it's been for the past few years, but I also imagine some pretty significant changes into the future, and if we are especially lucky, a real excuse to give Ubisoft the gold medal. We know it can win.
1, 2, 3, 4. Sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, everything that makes me feel so wonderful when we're together. Brighter than a lucky penny when you're near. The rain goes, disappears, dear, and I feel so fine. Just to know